Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, present in all places and filling all things, come and dwell in us, cleanse every stain, and save our souls, O gracious Lord. I'd like to take the beginning of this class, just like I did last time, to read an excerpt um, from Unseen Warfare as just kind of a spiritual discussion before we get into the meat of step 3. In one of the earlier chapters, we said that it is more useful and advantageous to spend some time exercising oneself in one virtue than in many virtues at once, and that therefore one should turn to the profit of this one virtue all events we meet, however different they may be. Now listen, and I will show you how this can be done without difficulty. If, for example, it should happen that on the same day, or even in the course of the same hour, you are blamed unjustly for an action blameless in itself, or you are refused some request, or if something happens and you are unfairly suspected of something bad, or if some bodily illness afflicts you, or one of your superiors compels you to do something you do not like, or you meet some other unpleasant and unbearable thing of which our poor human life is so full, then because of the varied nature of these similar occurrences, differing virtuous actions are demanded of you. But following the rule you have established, it is better for you to direct them all towards exercising yourself in the particular virtue you are working on at that time. Thus, if at the moment you meet the occurrences mentioned, you are chiefly exercising yourself in patience, then take care to endure them with patience and joy. If you are chiefly occupied with progress in humility, strive to realize that you deserve every kind of evil and have earned the adversities that you have met yourself with. If your work is to acquire the virtue of obedience, force yourself to bend your neck submissively to the mighty hand of God, and for the sake of pleasing Him, submit willingly to His creatures, whether or not they have reason or life, through whom He sends you these adversities and afflictions. If you are striving to succeed in poverty, incite in yourself contentment, joy, and thankfulness that you are deprived of all earthly and worldly comfort. If you labor at making your love both higher and more deeply rooted, try to evoke in yourself feelings of love for your neighbor, since at that moment he is an instrument of the good you may extract from these incidents, and urge yourself to love God, since, now as always, he is the first cause of love, and sends such afflictions or allows them for your spiritual progress. From what I have said, you can see for yourself how to use, for the exercise of one and the same virtue, adversities which are not brief, but last for a long time, such as illness, for instance, or similar things. So before we get into the chapter on exile and pilgrimage, what are your thoughts after hearing this little spiritual vitamin? From the work on unseen warfare. Keeping in mind that a lot of what we are discussing is in fact geared towards monastics, but there is applications for us in the um, secular world. I'm going to close my door for a second because they're cleaning the church.
Overall review, there's so many things we have to do. We can't get overwhelmed with trying to do everything at once, but try to do one thing at a time. This is kind of what I gathered out of that.
Okay. What else?
Am I hitting close to the mark?
The idea that the author is trying to get at is that oftentimes we can feel overwhelmed when we're trying to strive after virtue. And what we end up doing is we think, well, I need to get love, I need to get patience, I need to get humility, I need to get love for God. And it can seem overwhelming because you're trying to achieve all of these virtues. And when you see different, instances in our life, we say to ourselves, "Oh my goodness, I should be patient here. I should be kind here. I should be grateful here." And then after the fact, you go, "Oh, I missed these opportunities." But what the author is trying to get at is that if we are striving for a particular type of virtue, whether it's kindness or love or gentleness, to view everything, every action that comes our way through that particular lens. To say, okay, no matter what, I'm trying to focus on kindness. So I'm going to try to be kind in everything that I do here. To bend each action towards that virtue. Go ahead.
It's confusing though, because if someone is saying you did something which you didn't do, you're totally innocent, is it saying that we should not try to defend ourselves, that we should?
We need to look to the question as to what is the purpose. Now, for an example of that, we can look to St. Nectarius of Egina. St. Nectarius is arguably one of the greatest saints of our age, and he was bishop of Pentopolis. And the bishops that were around him were jealous of him. And so they made up lies about him, horrible lies, lies that got to the patriarch's ear. And even though the patriarch knew they could not possibly be true, they were so filthy and bad that he felt he had no choice but to remove St. Nectarius from his position. And according to our understanding of St. Nectarius, he didn't argue it. He didn't try to defend himself. And everywhere St. Nectarius went, he kept planting good. And yet these rumors and these lies kept following him. And he kept getting chased from place to place to place to place. To the point that even after he died, the local bishop thought that he was a cursed, sinful person. And even when his body was incorrupt, the bishop said, well, it's incorrupt because he's so cursed by God that he won't even decompose. And it wasn't until shortly after that that it was revealed that St. Nectarius was not just not decomposing, but was fragrant with myrrh and just absolutely sanctified. And it was then that the people started to show and come and come and come. So the question is, why are you trying to refute what is happening to you? What is the benefit? And by that, I mean, is it something that is to just advance you? Is it something to basically say, well, it's my pride. I don't want to be seen that way. Because the reality is that truth comes out eventually. Eventually, whether it's in this life or the next, reality happens. We see what actually happened. And so when we try to force our will, our pride, to say, well, I'm right, then what happens? We lose ourselves. We lose ourselves in the pursuit of being proven right. But to what end? You know, this is one of the reasons why in my marriage counseling classes, I quote someone that said, basically, in marriage, you can be right or you can be married. Which is to say, yes, you could win your argument. You can force your way to win. But was it worth it if you've destroyed your relationship? So the question is, what are you trying to gain? And keeping in mind, again, this is largely geared towards monastics. Monastics are supposed to, we're going to get into this, about exile. They're supposed to have exiled themselves from this world and its vagaries and its pride. So the question is, why do you want to prove yourself right? Is it for the sake of truth? Or is it for the sake of pride?
Probably pride, but I mean, it's because you feel like you've been unjustly accused of something that you're totally innocent of. And you're right, it's probably pride too, because you don't want other people to think, oh, this person did this. You know, so you're thinking you want to justify yourself.
What happened when Christ was accused of false things?
Didn't say anything, right?
Exactly. He didn't even respond to it. He just let them say their lies. So, what does that tell us? Don't worry about it. Because ultimately, if you're keeping one eye on this world, and we're going to get into that on exile, because again, exile and detachment are related, then we're having some problems. So, any other thoughts before we move into exile? Okay, so in exile, which is a very difficult read because you have to separate for yourself a little bit when he is speaking directly about monastic exile and exile that is pertinent to us. So, for example, in your own words, how would you interpret exile to be applicable in your life and not necessarily to a monk?
We have to constantly remember every day that we're not living for the things around us and our jobs and our families and things. That we're only here with a greater goal in mind at the end. And so everything that we're doing now is not the final thing, but it's only serving a higher purpose. And I think even like the first point here talks about what exile means and a practical sense, even not even for months, but it's just modest manners, wisdom, which remains unknown wisdom. So I'm picturing like we've been saying here, like a wisdom you may have a knowledge of something, but if it's not helpful to those around you, you don't need to puff up and say, oh, I know all of these things, look at me. It's kind of using your knowledge to help others reach the goal as well, not only win battles here.
So, what else?
Well, I think it also, to me, means that you shouldn't get so involved in contrivances, things that are happening around you to keep the bigger picture in mind. It was a very hard read, I have to say. It was a lot that I just didn't understand, that you should be wanting to be humiliated. It's like, okay, I mean, it's a little hard to accept that, that you're looking for some of these things, your desire for humiliation. I'm thinking like, well, I don't know if I'm desiring to be humiliated, And it was very difficult to me reading this.
So when we're looking at this, we have sort of a dichotomic element here, because going out into exile in and of itself is not beneficial if it doesn't ultimately bring fruit back to the rest of humanity. And yet, it is focusing on the idea that unless we do exile, we will not be able to have that benefit to humanity. And throughout many of these little points, St. John of the Ladder warns to basically say, be careful, because you might think that you've been away for 1-2 years, that somehow you are ready. You're ready to come and bring good back to the earth. Or worse, and more dangerous, you begin to think that because you are exiled from humanity and all of its vagaries and all of its sins, that somehow you are better than they. Whereas what it is focusing on is less on the idea of looking around you and more of looking at yourself. In a way, this is a very selfish chapter, because what is it essentially saying regarding how to save yourself?
Ignore everybody else.
To an extent.
I mean, that's the impression I got, was just like everybody else, just concentrate on yourself.
Because what it's basically saying is that you aren't good to anybody if you can't save yourself. If you can save yourself, then others will be saved too. And this is one of the statements that I've heard many priests say to individuals that ask them, well, what can I say to my brother? What can I say to my sister or my friend or my parent or my children? What's the golden word that's going to save them? Because I need to save them. Well, that kind of mentality is a problem. We've talked about it before. It's like, When you see someone drowning, it's a natural response to say, I want to go swim and save them. I want to go get them out of there. But what happens if you dive into the water?
You drown too.
It doesn't matter if you're an Olympic swimmer. You're going to drown. Because a person's flailing about, they're not seeing what they're doing. So what is the only way to save somebody that's drowning?
Throw them a buoy.
Well, that's not necessarily going to help them if they're drowning. The buoy's over there. How are they supposed to get it?
You do get it for them.
Exactly. You don't see the lifeguards just say, throw the lifeguards. It's like, okay, good luck. They swim it out because they're expert swimmers, so they can get there fast. But ultimately, who is going to do the saving? The buoy, and in this case, Christ. So it's very, very important for us to make that distinction, to understand in order to save someone, we have to save ourselves. We have to become expert swimmers to get that buoy out to them. Because the reality is that we may think we're expert swimmers, but then we realize that we've been swimming and like, oh no, my friend that's drowning is now 100 yards that way and I'm over here. So we are seeking exile. Now, exile can be a good thing. Verse 6 says, detachment is excellent, but her mother is exiled. We're going to see a lot of this throughout the latter divine ascent, the idea of mother and children, talking about virtues and talking about mother sins. So having become an exile for the Lord's sake, we should have no ties of affection at all, lest we seem to be roving in order to gratify our passions. So in other words, exile needs to be for a purpose. If you're exiled without a purpose or for not a good reason, then it is not holy. This is one of the reasons why St. John of the Ladder draws the distinction between a monastic's exile and the exile of Eve from the garden. One was voluntary, which has a good reward, and one is involuntary because it would have caused more damage. So holy exile is an exile that is chosen because you're trying to get somewhere, which is ironic because if you are an exile, it means that you are a foreigner and that you are a stranger. This kind of gets to Dr. Ed's point in which he said that basically you're supposed to look at this world as transient, that it is not a permanent place. Our focus should not just be on this world, but on the next world. And so to be an exile means that you are in a strange place. Put another way, what does the word holy mean?
Set apart.
Set apart. Not of this world, separate, different. So to be an exile in this world means that you are set apart within this world. So you're in the world, but you're not of the world, which means you are in exile. Now, just to give a little bit of personal history, I'm a military brat, so I grew up all over the place. I was very jealous of children that were able to talk about friends that they had since kindergarten, that they grew up with. I never had that. We would move every 3 to 5 years, so friends would, change based on, when it was time to move. And when I came to be at the metropolis of Chicago, when I was working as a registrar at the metropolis and acting as Bishop Dimitri of Mokysos's driver, I recognized that I was a foreigner to the land of Chicago because I was originally from the Detroit metropolis, from Memphis, Tennessee. And many people would tell me, oh, you'll get used to it, you'll get used to it, you'll get used to it, you'll be one of the Chicagoans in no time. And there was a part of me that was resistant to this. And the reason why I was resistant to that was because everywhere I went, I drove all over the metropolis. Everywhere I went, people were so kind. Now, it might be because I was the driver of the bishop and everyone wanted to be polite, but I thought to myself, everyone's being kind, everyone's nice. And I'm so grateful for that. Because who am I? I'm not one of their children. I'm not someone that they know, but they're kind to me. And I thought to myself, I never want to lose that feeling of gratitude. Because when you're a foreigner in a strange land, you're grateful for what is given to you. You don't ever feel that it is owed to you. And so I never wanted to lose that feeling of being a foreigner. And that is another translated title for this chapter, is to become a foreigner. To be treating yourself that you are not in your homeland. Because what is our actual homeland? Where are we actually trying to go? And this is where Dr. Ed said, which was paradise. Understand that our focus is not on this world. So let's take a moment and look at some of our favorite lines. What was some of our favorite verses? We haven't heard from Dr. Tobias. Let's hear from him.
I kind of like 13.
13. Oh, picked a really short one. He is an exile who, having knowledge, sits like one of foreign speech among people of another tongue. What struck you about that? What was compelling about that line?
Well, again, it kind of puts you in exile when you're not trying to overrule somebody else, or like today's society, they just jump on you trying to put their viewpoints out there, and there's that colloquialism, better to keep your mouth shut than to open your mouth and prove you're a fool.
A fool is revealed when he opens his mouth.
Yeah.
I like that, and it reminds me of a sort of a humbling moment for me when I was speaking with one of my brother priests, and we were doing a tandem event with some young kids, and I kept wanting to make points, and finally, after the event was over, my brother priest came to me and said, "Father, forgive me if I'm wrong in saying this, but are you saying these things because you have something to add or because you need to be heard?" And to me, that was a very powerful indictment because it made me start to think, what was my motivation to speak? And so, Dr. Tobias, you're very right to look at this. He is an exile who, having knowledge, sits like one of foreign speech among people of another tongue. So, in other words, a person that can answer their question, but pretends that he's foolish. I don't know if any of you have read the book Father Arseny, um, but it is an incredible read. And one of the most powerful moments is everyone seemed to think that this priest was just an idiot, that he was uneducated, and then they find out that he's actually the premier art historian of Russia. Like, he's written books. He's like absolutely, completely known within the circles of higher learning. But he didn't say anything. He didn't reveal his wisdom because it would not have been beneficial to him. He was treating himself as an exile, a foreigner, because he was focused on what was important. Dr. Ed, what was one of your favorite lines?
I liked number 11 a lot, and it's a long one, but when I was thinking about about it, I kind of tied it in with the point that you were making before, about how if you're going to go about trying to save someone, even if you're concerned about a family member, your children even, you have to make sure that you're equipped first, that you're in no position to help them until you are saved yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And so when he talks about, someone who goes away and acquires some degree of piety, then they might start to think, because of the vain thoughts, they begin to rise up into urges to go back for the edification of many things. Now, I think about this when I'm on social media, for instance, like, oh, I have a little bit of knowledge about this. Why don't I tell you what's what here?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just getting into like a flame war, what they call a flame war.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to win arguments, and like nobody's getting saved. So that idea kind of struck me. And then at the end, he does say that this is possible. Those who have left their own people in childlike simplicity at the beginning and have since become completely purified may profitably return to their former land, perhaps even with the intention, after saving themselves, of saving others too. So, this is ultimately achievable, but in these steps, we're only on step 3 here. Nobody is saved at step 3 of the ladder. You've got to advance well beyond this stage before you're saved and equipped enough to go back and address social media.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of a joke where someone says, "Well, I took it was the first class of Psych 101. I understand how the world works now."
Yeah. I stayed at a Holiday Inn last night, or whatever the commercials are.
Exactly, and that's the thing, is that we get a little bit in, and suddenly we think we're ready, we're good to go. And this happens a lot for people, that they get just a little bit on their spiritual journey, and then suddenly they think they're an expert and able to, inform everybody. I call it Yeronda syndrome, where somebody hears a spiritual good, and then they think that they're going to be the one that teaches everyone how to do things. And this is true for priests too, where priests might think, like, for example, St. Nectarius' figure. St. Nectarius didn't do this, but it's very possible that a priest might have said, I was a metropolitan of Pentopolis. I'm educated. I'm a writer. And he was going to the small little villages as a preacher, an iterate preacher. When you think to yourself about some of these giants, St. John of Kronstadt, some of these simple priests, and yet they're giants because they recognized that they needed to find salvation. St. Porphyrius, who we just celebrated today, he became well known because of the people's lives that he touched, but he was a simple chaplain in Athens. He couldn't even stay on Mount Athos because of his health. And so it's this idea that when we are at the stage where we can actually help someone, it'll happen organically. We don't need to seek it out on our own. Absolutely, Dr. Ed. That one stuck with me too. Pat, which verse stuck with you?
Well, I love the poetry of number 26.
Number 26.
About the dream.
Oh, yes.
It's just so beautifully poetic, that whole statement.
A dream is a movement of the mind while the body is at rest. A fantasy is an illusion of the eyes when the intellect is asleep. A fantasy is an ecstasy of the mind when the body is awake. A fantasy is the appearance of something which does not exist in reality. You're right, Pat. That is a very strong, poetic, powerful indictment of how we are supposed to understand dreams. Because and this is why he has this separate section, is because you may have exiled yourself from the world, but you are still vulnerable in sleep. And there are some that are vulnerable even when they're awake, and they allow themselves to daydream, to fantasize about certain things that are not rooted in reality. Mrs. Tobias?
Yes, I like 24 in that, as we're trying to strive and then that you could lose it in an instant if even though you have done all this hard labor and you've reached a certain plateau, and instantly, you could fall, or looking at others that are not at your same level and saying, oh, look at them, things like that, and so I thought, well, that's good to remember that you can't get full of yourselves as you're trying.
Absolutely. Let me go ahead and read it and then give kind of a comparison to kind of our current world. By much labor and effort, a good and firm disposition is developed in us. But what is achieved with great labor can be lost in an instant. For evil company doth corrupt good manners, being at once worldly and disorderly. The man who associates with people of the world or approaches them after his renunciation will certainly either fall into their traps or will defile his heart by thinking about them. Or if he is not defiled himself yet, by condemning those who are defiled, he too will himself be defiled. Now, what this could essentially be in a real world application, and then we can, again, parse it out to the spiritual, is let's say that you're an alcoholic, and you've gone to AA, and you've achieved sobriety. And then you think, well, I'm in control of myself. I can go to a bar with barflies. So what he's saying is one of two things is going to happen. One, you're going to either fall back into the bad habit, or two, and which is perhaps even worse, you will start judging the barflies. Look at these people that have no self-control. How shameful, how terrible. Why can't they be like me? And so you're right, that is a very dangerous thing. And we can take that spiritual example for anything. Rather than looking at ourselves once we've gained some level of self-control on any matter of thing, we cannot have the arrogance say, well, I'm cured of that ailment or that vice or that temptation. You must always be vigilant and then also compassionate to those who are struggling with the same thing. Steve, what was your favorite?
I don't know if this is my favorite, but this is one that I picked out here. 16, the love of God extinguishes our love for our parents.
Mm-hmm.
And then it goes on to talk about no man can serve two masters. I think that's something that I, struggle with.
I was about to say, it's like, did you like that verse, or were you struggling with it?
No, I didn't.
No, I struggle with the concept.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because it's so difficult to not be part of the world, and
this is one of the verses that is very difficult.
Says the Lord to bring peace on earth, which is kind of an interesting
Mm-hmm.
thing, because you think of God as bringing peace to the earth, but that is the parentheses, the love of parents among sons and brothers who have resolved to serve me. But so it's separate lovers of God from lovers of the world. Well, it's, we go back and forth. I know I go back and forth between those two polar opposites.
So this is one of the verses that is distinctly monastic, but also has real-world applications. The distinct level in this is where a parent, and this happens for clergy and monastics, where the parent will say, if you love me, you won't do this. You will not join the monastery. You will not join the clergy. There are many parents that feel that for one of two reasons. Either one, they don't feel like it's a prestigious enough career field, or they feel that their child is going to be torn limb from limb with the judgments of the world. And so parents, for these monastics, can become a problem, because now they're looking to say, okay, well, I want to please my parents, but I also want to please God, because I've made this choice. I've decided this is what I'm going to do. And so they feel drawn. And so St. John of the Ladder is saying that they have to extinguish that. To say, I will put my priority on God first. And so I have to cut off myself from my parents because that needs to be my number one first priority. And so that's what he means by love of God extinguishes our love for our parents, meaning that because we're focused on God, and that's our first aim, our first priority, everything else becomes background. Everything else is like, okay, that's fine. But this is why it says that we had to renounce our parents in the previous chapter. We have to renounce everything. We have to exile ourselves to say, okay, that's it. I'm done. And this is one of the reasons why Jesus Christ in another place said, where St. John is quoting Christ, where they said, your brothers and your mothers are here. Your mother and your brothers are here. And Jesus Christ answered them, my mother and my brothers are those who do the will of God. Now,
Father, one thing I didn't like about that one particular part, he said, I forgot the attribute before, but he said hatred. I don't understand why he would say that. That disturbed me.
Which line?
Me too.
Let me see.
Where was I remember that too, Mrs. Tobias.
Which verse was that? I'm trying to remember.
Looking for it.
Let's see, it's on page 8. I don't see that. Let's see.
Number 14.
Oh, where I'm quoting. Yeah.
Yes, this passionate hatred when he said, my mother and my brethren are they who will do the will of my, in other words, are they who will do the will of my Father who is in heaven. But dispassionate, okay, but hatred?
Right.
Keep in mind, this translation isn't the greatest, but apathia, this passionate hatred is not a good translation. Apathia is the word, and it means passionless, which means that you're not being pulled by your emotions.
Oh, okay.
So it's an emotionless statement. In other words, it could be interpreted as cold. So when it says passionate hatred,
Maybe apathetic.
but apathetic is also, even though that's an exact translation, is also misses the translation. Apathia, in this case, dispassion, means that you are not being controlled by your emotions.
Right.
So when we're saying that, when he's making that statement, he's like, of course Jesus Christ has filial love for his family. St. John the theologian was his step nephew. But why was he the beloved disciple? Was it because of family ties? No, it was because when everyone else ran away, John was there. And even in the gospel passage that we hear for Feast of the Virgin Mary, where a woman in the crowd said, blessed is the womb that bore you and the breast that you suck. Which of course is true, because she is the Theotokos. She bore in her womb God. So we don't call her Christotokos. We don't call her that. We call her Theotokos because she bore in her womb God. But Jesus Christ immediately responds and says, no, blessed rather are those who hear the word of God and keep it. Now, a very cursory read of that tells us that, oh, well, he's downplaying his mother. Like, oh, that's not a big deal. It's just Christians are where it's at. No, what he's actually saying is, you're right to honor Mary. And it is true, she is the Theotokos. But what makes Mary supernally amazing is the fact that she hears the word of God and keeps it, guards it, treasures it. That is what makes her amazing. That's what makes her blessed. And so what we're seeing here is that true parenthood and true friends is this. And that kind of segues into my favorite verse. My favorite verse was 15. Let him be your father who is able and willing to labor with you in bearing the burden of your sins. So in other words, your father needs to be a great spiritual father. And your mother, contrition, which can cleanse you from impurity. Contrition meaning that you're repenting, that you feel bad about what you've done. And your brother, your comrade who toils and fights side by side with you in your striving towards the heights. These are our brother Christians, or brother priests if you're a priest, or brother monks if you're a monk. Acquire an inseparable wife, the remembrance of death. Now that's powerful, because your number one concern as a spouse is always the other. And so if your spouse is remembrance of death, that means that you're thinking about that always. And this really kind of harkens back to the very beginning statement that Dr. Ed made, which is to say, where should our focus be? On the hour of our death. Not about despair. Not to say, oh, well, everybody's going to die. But to understand that when we die, this illusion of this life, this fantasy, ends. And then we're judged. And so we have to be always cognizant of that. I remember asking a priest, I don't mind saying it was Father Telemachos, Alikakos of St. Spiridon. I asked him, I said, why do you think people keep sinning? I was at a funeral with him. And he said, you know why, Patrimo? Because no one believes they're going to die. We sin and we hurt people with abandon because we believe that, well, that'll happen to them. It's not going to happen to me. I'm not going to die. And we see that in Greek communities. Even mentioning the word death is, taboo, as if you're going to somehow bring death into the room. It's this idea that we're somehow never going to die. There will never be a judgment. But if your inseparable wife is the remembrance of death, then you're cognizant always on the day of your death. And by that, it means your judgment. And let your beloved children be the size of your heart. Children are the physical manifestation of prayers of parents. So your children, the size of your heart, should be the seeking of the virtues. Make your body your slave, control it. And your friends, the holy powers, the angels, who can help you at the hour of your death, if they become your friends. Now, isn't that something? And I always think about that when I read the prayer to the guardian angel at night. Angels have personalities. Angels have wills. And if we reject them and push them away, are they obligated to help us? No. They can say, I've tried. What am I supposed to do? He doesn't want me. They want to help us because they see that God loves us. But if we don't make them our friends and we push them away, then there's no one there to help us. And at the hour of our death, if we think back to the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, when Lazarus died, who was there to help him? The angels. This is the generation family of those who seek the Lord. I mean, when I read that, I had to reread it like 4 times. I was like, oh my gosh. That really hit me. That really pierced me. So, this is a chapter in which we are looking at the concept of monastics leaving the world, but we are supposed to take this in a different way. So I asked it earlier, and we're going to close with this with the last 15 minutes. What do you interpret this to mean when we say exile? Because obviously, and this is one of the problems and why we tell lay people not to read the Letter of Divine Ascent without clergy, because oftentimes what happens is people read this and their thought after reading the first 3 chapters like, well, I'm damned. Unless you're a monk, you're not going to heaven. And that's not true at all. That's not the case. Obviously, monastics are able to achieve heavenly virtues and heights because they are living like the angels. But salvation is 100% possible for a layperson, and this is applicable to the layperson as well. So Ed answered a little bit the first, but so we're going to go to him last. Steve, how do you view this chapter as applicable to your daily life?
Well, before I get there, let me just say, and I think I might have, did I say this somewhere else, but when reading this,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it made me think of the prisoners
Mm-hmm.
don't voluntarily banish themselves, but are banished.
Mm-hmm.
And as it says, like in number 18, for our solitary life, let us choose places where there are few opportunities for comfort and ambition, but more for humility. Otherwise, we shall be fleeing in company with our passions. I mean, for some people, that's selected for them.
Correct. If we look,
Said that,
you're right. And that kind of goes back to 8. Eve was exiled from paradise against her will, but the monk is willing exile from his home. She would have liked the tree of disobedience again, and he would certainly expose himself to frequent danger from relatives according to the flesh. And we see that within prison as well, that there is a huge turnaround of people that go in and out of prison, in and out of prison, in and out of prison, because it's involuntary exile and they haven't made it their own. Whereas when you read some of the letters of the inmates that have chosen to view their prison life as almost a monastic life, even if they wouldn't use those exact words, you see a radical change. The difference between the voluntary and the involuntary is huge. That's why you've seen some monks that were tonsured in prison that even though they were able to be paroled, they elected not to because they wanted to stay in their prison because they thought this is how I will achieve salvation. So I don't know if I went off tangent on what you were saying, Steve.
Yeah, well, let's turn that around in a way. In a way, our daily lives become a prison for us seeking God. So, I mean, what imprisons us? What keeps us from truly living? I don't mean as a monastic,
Mm-hmm.
but what keeps us from, really keeping that, that spirituality, that love of God in our heart.
You're absolutely right, Steve, talking about the invisible prison. Mm-hmm.
So that's, that's our prison.
You're right. There's no question that we are in shackles without even realizing it. And the problem is for many of us, we put the shackles on ourselves.
Right.
That's powerful. Pat?
Well, some of these I can definitely see as things that we can all strive for. Like, for example, number 19, do not glory in your distinction. Or number 24, by much labor and effort, a good and firm disposition. I think that's applicable to all of us.
Mm-hmm.
But then, when I look at something like number 23, attachment to others really is dangerous. You separate yourself completely, both in thought and body, from your own relatives and from others. I can't apply that to myself.
No, this one is, again, for one like 23, it is important to understand that this is talking about a monastic.
Okay.
That attachment either to some particular relative or stranger is dangerous. However, that being said, and this is very difficult because I've seen it in funerals, both for funerals for children and funerals for parents, is that when we and we talked about this a little bit in detachment, but when we become our children or our parents almost like an idol, where if they die, then somehow, my life is over, then that's problematic. That is dangerous because that is taking you away. Whereas if you're able to say, okay, I see this, and of course I'll be sad if they die, but to understand that there is paradise, to understand that there is continuity in this life and the next, is very, very important. And so we have to understand that the The through line for that one, Pat, is not the idea of the monastic way of basically saying that, well, it's dangerous for you to even think of your parents or your relatives, even if you were friends, because it's going to pull you back into the world. Okay, that's understandable for monastic. But for you, or for me, what we see to that is attachment. To be too attached is a problem.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. So, okay.
This is one of the things where, my spiritual father joked with me. He says, God doesn't want you to not love your kids. He just wants you to love him just a little bit more, just an inch more.
I can do that.
Dr. Tobias?
I'm in total agreement with Pat. I like that. What she said. But we all have the fault of loving our family too much and not putting God above,
Yeah.
well, everything. I mean, it's this whole time. I mean, it's so intertwined. It's the whole concept is, it's hard to conceive, and yet there it is.
Mm-hmm. It's all interrelated. It kind of reminds me of this was the youth ministry tangent, in which, parents were given a vase, said, describe your child. And each flower is a quality of your child. And so they would write, okay, well, he likes English, he's in basketball, he likes baseball, he likes comic books, and he's good in sciences, and he's an altar boy, and I guess he's a Christian, so that's another flower. And so the problem that we have with that is that people look at their Christianity, their faith, and their relationship with God as just one aspect of us. Whereas what we're trying to do is have a paradigm shift to say, okay, no. Yes, those flowers are qualities, but the vase, needs to be Christian. I'm a Christian English student, a Christian basketball player, a Christian reader, a Christian everything. Because when you put that paradigm shift and you put your whole focus on this is everything, all of these parts are qualities of me. My Christian life can't just be a piece of who I am. It needs to be the framework of who I am that informs all of the other parts of who I am. When that happens, then we're able to exude God. But that can only be done in exile. And all of these things, the detachment, the exile, what are they essentially doing? They are emptying us. And we're going to get to the point soon where we're going to be seeing what we're going to fill that emptiness with. Mrs. Tobias?
And the question is, like, what did we get from this that would be applicable in this world?
Yeah.
I think, especially like part of 17, where, and I'm guilty of this too. I mean, where we look at, we want this for our house, we want this improvement, we want that, we want this, and everything seems to be focused on that when it should be on God. And, too much emphasis on the love of your home, of your family, of, and I know I'm guilty of it, and it's a hard thing because it seems like, to try, you have to make a concerted effort to change your focus.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I'm looking at, is that, it says where it says that you have to beware, be exposed to the deluge of sentiment through your attachments to things of anything, really, your home, and more so on everything. And I also, I know I'm guilty of it, and I'm sure a lot of parents are, where, I'm looking at my children, I want this for them or that for them, I want to see what they're doing. And, and you have to leave these things to God and pray to God, to send his angels to help. And that's what I'm looking at in this section.
That's a very powerful point, and I love the line because it sounds heartless, but it actually is full of heart for you as a person. It said, "Do not be moved by the tears of parents or friends, otherwise you will be weeping eternally." And it's not talking just about the idea of if you follow that, you're going to go to hell and you'll be weeping in hell. What he's talking about is that if you are always moved by other people, you will always have anxiety. You will always be crying because you don't know what you're doing. Whereas if you are focused on what you're doing, then you can be like Christ when he was confronted with his family and have apathia. To be able to go forward and say, okay, I know you're upset, but this is what I have to do. All right, we're going to close with Dr. Ed.
Well, I guess in one of these final points, it's actually at point 20, he finally brings in the idea of Abraham. And so when I think about, he doesn't expound on it very much, but when I think about Abraham and the story of Abraham,
mm-hmm.
Abraham was essentially a layman, right? He was an enormously wealthy individual,
mm-hmm.
but he was willing to go where God commanded him to go. So he was willing to become an exile. He didn't regard his comforts and his wealth and his animals and his family and his servants as kind of what he was about, but he was about obeying God. And so I think, these first three steps, we can wrangle Abraham into all of them in regard to detaching himself from the things of this world. He was willing to sacrifice his own son
mm-hmm.
because he had some greater vision before him. And so I think about all the ways, probably none of us are willing to sacrifice our children in that way, or maybe we're not yet. But I think about the ways we can sacrifice daily. I think about the ways that, just the cycle of fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays, and then the cycles of fasting throughout other times in the years, how those are just efforts to, detach ourselves from idols.
Mm-hmm.
If food is an idol, it's a way to detach ourselves from that. Then there are other things in our lives that we can detach ourselves from those in other ways, if we discern those with our families and our spiritual fathers. So I just think I look at Abraham as kind of like actually a point of reference for us as lay people, more so than I do with a lot of these more specific things that he talks about with respect to monks and hating their family.
I think that's perfect. Because especially when we're looking to the idea of the remembrance of death, when Jesus Christ gave us the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, who was comforting Lazarus in that story? Father Abraham. And constantly we're reminded that the faith that we're supposed to have as Christians, the model that we're supposed to follow, is Abraham's faith, Abraham's model. So Dr. Ed is right. You can take Abraham, our patriarch, the model of our faith, as the through line to this, to say that is what it means. And it also means of how you do it in the world, because that's what Abraham did. Because Abraham wasn't a monk. That's profound. I love that. Absolutely love that. I'm glad the Spirit told me to end on you, Dr. Ed, because I don't think anybody can can end the night on a better contextual note. I love it.
Father?
Yes.
I have trouble making a sharp distinction between detachment in step 1 and our discussion of exile here in step 3. They seem very similar in a lot of ways.
They are, and I came on when I said it earlier, that, where is it? that these are children of each other. That exile is the mother and detachment is the child. Where did you go?
Okay.
And we're going to get into that in great deal when we're looking at some of the sins of mother sins. And this is one of the reasons why spiritual fathers are considered physicians, is because essentially with sin and with virtues, you're looking at symptoms. And so the symptom is usually the result of something deeper. So detachment stems from exile. So exile is the mother, it's the heart. And so what was happening was St. John of the Ladder was starting out here with detachment and pulling us towards the mother of detachment, which is exile, the heart of it. You can't understand exile truly unless you're able to comprehend detachment. And so that's why he started there and came here. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I see why we need a clergy to guide us.
Yeah.
It's really very heavy, very difficult.
It's a long journey, but you know what? I'm enjoying taking it with you.
Thanks,
So
Father.
next week we'll go into step 4 on blessed and ever memorable obedience. All right. Have a blessed and wonderful day. Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, present in all places, filling all things, come and dwell in us, cleanse every stain, and save our souls, O gracious Lord. Amen.
I mean,
Thank you, Father.
Night all.
Right.